Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's such a pleasure to see so many of you tonight together with us here. 2 years ago, I got a message from Ur, and he said, "Have you read this?" He added a picture of book of Hikmet Karčić. I said, "No, is it good?" "Steengoed," was his answer. "It's excellent." In that case, we should bring Hikmet to the Netherlands for a book talk or something like that. You are definitely right. And we should do that any time soon. So 2 years later, here we are. And I'm honored to be the moderator of this evening. For those who don't know me, my name is Alma Mustafić. I'm an educational scientist, lecturer and researcher at Utrecht University of Applied Science. My field of interests are genocide and human rights education. This is a passion rooted in my own history. In 1995, I survived Srebrenica genocide, but sadly, many of my family members did not, including my father, who was working for Dutch-bed soldiers. I sued the Dutch state for the death of my father, and in 2013, the Supreme Court of the Netherlands ruled in my favor. Ever since then, I try to increase knowledge and awareness about this genocide. And I think this is exactly the reason why they asked me to do this tonight. As I have never done this before, please go easy on me. So that's it. But what brings us together? The aim of this evening would be to discuss a very difficult but yet very important topic: concentration camps. When we talk about concentration camps, we often think of Second World War, and of course with a very good reason. But we would like to raise awareness about the fact that those concentration camps don't belong to the history, that they are very much alive in today's world. During this event, we will explore 2 case studies, concentration camps as instruments of terror in Bosnia during the 19th and in Syria in our days. And I think the existence of those destructive practice, I don't know how to call them other way, force us to know more about it, and to take action, I think, at the end. So before I introduce our speakers, I would like to know who do we have here. So the colleague, lecturers and researchers, can you please stand up? Or raise your hand. Just one? I cannot believe. Okay, yes. Students? Okay. Journalists? No? Do we have some people from Syria or Bosnia? Yeah. Do we have some survivors of concentration camps in Bosnia or prisons in Syria? No? Yes, we do. I saw... Oh, does it work? Yeah? I think I saw a hand. Yes, 2. Is it okay if I ask you? Yeah? So what is your name, and please help us.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Amir Grabic. I'm from Bosnia. I was born in Prijedor, and I was in the concentration camps when I was 1 year old with my parents. And I have my mom with me as well. She doesn't speak English, so I'm taking it up for her.
Yeah. And which concentration camp?
Ternopolje.
Ternopolje. Okay, we will be hearing more about it. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for being here. Is there a question or something that you would like to say us before we start?
I was a bit in a rush, so I didn't really prepare, but I think along the way I'll probably have some questions.
Thank you. I think you being here is enough for us, right? To understand when we talk about concentration camps, we are not talking about past, we are talking about presence. And those people are very much alive and that they are among us. So thank you for coming tonight here with us. So let me outline the course of the evening with you. Firstly, each of our guests will get 10 minutes to present their book. And following, I will ask some questions, and at the end you will have opportunity to ask the questions you may have. But we also have an intermezzo, and Vladimir Petrovic is going to read some parts of the both books, right? So, I forgot that I can use this one. I'm going to do my best, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, it's with great honor that I introduce Professor Ugur Umit Ungur, a professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam and NIOD. With expertise spanning the global history of genocide and mass violence, Professor Ungur's research, particularly focused on modern violence and the Middle East, has helped us understand some of the most upsetting parts of our history. His extensive publication, including Genocide, New Perspective on its causes, courses and consequences, The Making of Modern Turkey, and Paramilitarism, Mass Violence in the Shadow of the State, demonstrate his profound contribution to the field. As editor and co-editor of several high-impact journals, he continues to lead scholarly discourse on those very critical issues. He is also coordinator of the Syrian Oral History Project, which led him to this extraordinary book, Syrian Gulag Inside Assad Prison System. He understands as no other why is it important to preserve and include the voices of those affected by mass violence such as war and genocide. From a shy Turkish boy sitting in the back of the classroom to a highly, highly respected professor of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies, a true legend in his field. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ugur with a warm applause. And then, ladies and gentlemen, it's my utmost pleasure to introduce to you one of the most prominent scholars in the field of genocide studies, Professor Hikmet Karčić. Professor Karčić is a research associate, you have to wait a little bit, at the Institute for Research of Crimes Against Humanity at the University of Sarajevo. Professor Karčić has also a very successful career with many years of dedicated research and academic excellence in understanding some of the darkest chapters of our history. He was Auschwitz Institute Keene State College Global Fellow who has written in depth on genocide, genocide denial and prevention. His groundbreaking work, Torture, Humiliate, Kill inside the Bosnian Serb camp system, shed light on the horrors of crimes committed during Bosnian genocide, providing significant understandings of human cost of genocide, violence and war. Professor Karčić's work goes beyond his research institute, as he is recognized globally for his contribution to Holocaust and genocide studies in general. Furthermore, Professor Karčić's exploration of topics such as far-right extremism and Islamophobia underscores his dedication to confronting issues of intolerance, prejudice, and hate speech. His articles are often published in leading national and international media. His work serves as a monument to his unflagging commitment to address the importance of remembrance, education, and justice in the face of historical injustices. It is with great, great honor that I present to you the best of the best in his field, the one and only Professor Hikmet Karčić. So now I have done my part of the job. I will ask Vlado, right, to start. And after your first reading, the floor is yours. Thanks.
During the night of June 28, 1992, in the eastern Bosnian town of Visegrad, hundreds of Bosnian Muslim civilians, mainly women and children, along with some elderly males, were incarcerated in the Hasan Veletovac Elementary School, where the sports hall, along with the other school facilities, had been converted into a temporary detention camp for the town's Bosnian Muslim Bosniak population. That night, their captors, local Bosnian Serbs, were celebrating Vidovdan, St. Vita's Day, a Serb Orthodox holiday, as well as the 603rd anniversary of the 1389 Kosovo battle, in which the invading Ottoman army defeated and subsequently invaded the then Serbian kingdom. That night, Milan Lukic, an already infamous member of the Bosnian Serb army, entered the sports hall with his fellow soldiers and took out an elderly man, Ibro Shabanovic. His screams were cut short as Milan Lukic and another soldier slit his throat and threw his severed head among the other imprisoned civilians, saying, "Balias, tonight is Vidovdan, you will all end up like this," and adding, "This is your kurban."
So now it's time for your presentation, Hikmet. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good evening. It's really a pleasure to see such a full house today, especially since I didn't know that tomorrow is a huge holiday here in the Netherlands. So it's really very impressive to see so many of you here today, and really thank you for coming. I would like to thank Ur, Alma, Vlado, the whole NIOD and University of Amsterdam team for having me here today, and it's really a pleasure to be here several times in a row in Amsterdam and in the Netherlands, and hopefully we'll see each other again soon, next year maybe. So I have like 10-15 minutes to quickly go through my publication, my book, and maybe several years of research which I conducted with survivors, with people, with family members, and so on, who went through the different camps in Bosnia. So I'll try to narrow this down to the main segments possible, and then the rest, for those interested more, can be read in the book, which is right here on the PowerPoint slide. So, on August 5th, 1992, British journalists entered the Omarska and Ternopolje camp in Prijedor and Kozarac, northwestern Bosnia and Herzegovina. After several months of rumors that concentration camps existed, the then Bosnian Serb president Radovan Karadzic gave permission to foreign journalists to go and to inspect the camps. The same day afterwards, there was an instruction which was sent to the camp officials to informing them that the foreign journalists are going to come and that the camps need to be tidied up, cleaned up, and the best-looking people should be brought out for presentation. So the image you see right here of Fikret Alic, a survivor of the Omarska camp, is one of the people who was there for presentation that day on August 5th, 1982. And this is the image of this, the man behind the wire, the skeleton man in the middle of Europe, half a century after the Holocaust, was something which ended up on major newspaper and magazines worldwide. So basically, this is one of the images which I saw as a child as well, and probably which later on affected me to continue my work in this field. In my book, Torture, Humiliate, Kill, I focus on 4 case studies. These are 4 towns which were deeply affected in 1992 and where different camp systems existed. So basically, it's Prijedor in the top where the photograph earlier was taken, then Bijeljina, which is in north eastern part of the country, Visegrad, where the event happened, which Vlado just read, and Bileća. So the reason why I took these 4 different towns was because these 4 different towns belong to geographically different areas in the country, but also it belongs to 4 different administrative units of the then Serb Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Because in order for the Serbs to set up, the Bosnian Serbs to set up the Bosnian Serb Republic, they set up something which they called the autonomous regions. So all of these autonomous regions, or these 4 autonomous regions, I took a town from each of them in order to show a pattern of the camp system which existed at that time. So to start off with Visegrad, this is a photograph which I came across reading The Atlantic in 2012. This photograph was published in 2012 on the 20th anniversary of the start of the Bosnian War in 1982. And when I saw this photograph, I realized that it was the first time I'm seeing it. And when I went deeper into it, I've realized that this is a photograph that belongs to a Belgrade-based journalist who took it inside the police station in Visegrad in 1992. And what I did is I gave it to a friend of mine who holds a Visegrad diaspora Facebook page. He put it online, and then the family members recognized their son, Jasmin Hodžić, who's being beaten right here, and who later on ended up in the Drina River, and whose body was exhumated in 2010, and who was identified from the Drina River. So this is actually the last image of Jasmin Hodžić alive in the Visegrad police station right before he was killed. So this photograph actually, and what was interesting for me was that this journalist who was working for the Associated Press, who actually had or was embedded with some of these perpetrators inside the police station and with others, and this photograph was basically sold to international media agencies throughout. This is the Hasan Veletova school where the infamous crime occurred, which was just read now from the book. Most of the schools, or most of the camps which existed in Bosnia, were made in schools. Why? Because the schools had a fence, which isn't visible right here. It had a huge gymnasium or a local gym, a sports hall where you could incarcerate a large number of people inside. And in this school, this is where from May to June and mid of July, this is where almost 500-600 people were incarcerated inside. And this right up here is Vilna Vlas. That is a hotel located some 7 kilometers away from Visegrad. This was a rape camp for women and girls from Visegrad. So this is a camp which was actually a spa hotel. And around 200 women and girls from Visegrad were kept inside of this hotel. And around 5 or 6 of them managed to survive the camp. And the rest were all killed, and most of their bodies are still unknown. And what is probably the most infamous part about Vilna Vlas is that it still functions as a spa hotel today. So you can find it on TripAdvisor, you can book a hotel night there, you can go and have lunch there. I was once taking a group of American professors, and we went inside, and there was a 5-year-old birthday party inside. So, you know, this hotel is actually hijacking the memories of the camp itself. There's no memorial whatsoever in any of these places. Now, speeding on to Prijedor, one of the infamous images from the ITN news report is the image of the men being brought in to have lunch, which was like a bean soup of sort, and they were all eating inside and looked, you know, with bread and, you know, looking happily. And on the side you had several Bosnian Serb policemen looking on, basically. So most of my research was based on the ICTY court records or on the exhibits which were available through the ICTY trials, but also on the trials which were located in Bosnia or in the region, the national courts. So I focused my whole entire work on the, let's say, the perpetrator documentation. So this, for example, is the order to establish Omarska. And right next to it is the list of the first category of the prisoners. So there were 3 categories of the prisoners who were kept in Omarska and Prijedor. Category number 1 was those who were most educated, or they were called the most extreme. They were the so-called elites of the local population, the most educated, the so-called social leaders of the most wealthiest, and so on and so forth. So here you had the full names, surnames, address, ID numbers, and so on of the people there. And this is the document which I mentioned earlier, where it is mentioned on the 3rd of August, saying that these camps need to be brought into a better, need to be tidied up and prepared for different news reports which were coming in, and the Red Cross which was coming on that day. So this was sent by the military commander to the military, to the camp commandants of Manjača, Trnopolje, Omarska, and Prijedor. And here, so there's a huge paper trail when we talk about the camps in Prijedor. They were the ones who were most effective in keeping records of all of the things which they were trying to organize and do. So thankfully to the ICTY, we have a large number of these documents still available or available at all, whereas in other cases such as Visegrad, the documentation was moved on in 1998, 1999 into Serbia proper or destroyed. And thirdly, it's also interesting that the local press, which existed in Prijedor, for example, Kozarski Vjesnik, which is a local newspaper there, would publish news about certain Bosnian Muslim extremists who were arrested or caught and so on and so forth. So this is, for example, Bećir Medunjanin, located right here, and this is his wife in the middle, and who were caught as civilians, of course. And a picture taken and published in newspapers. He and his wife both went missing later on and were found in mass graves. So this is one of the mass graves which was very infamous, the Tomašica mass grave, the largest mass grave in Bosnia, which probably had around 1,000 bodies by the end of 1992, 1993. Then the local population petitioned the municipality to remove the bodies because the water began to stink in their local villages. So this grave was removed and sent over to Jakarina Kosa and a few other locations. So in 2013, this mass grave was again managed to be reopened, and around 600 bodies or cases were found in this mass grave. What you see right here is ground zero, and this is basically the top of Tomašica, or the ground level. And here what you can see is around 8 to 10 meters in depth. And through my research, which was done after Tomašica was found, I went through the crisis committee documents of the Prijedor municipality, and I found that in June, July, August 1982, the crisis committee ordered more than 5,000 liters of diesel for the Tomašica mine for the purposes of sanitation. And sanitation is a new word or synonym for exhumation or sanitation of the ground, of the terrain. So basically, this is a paper trail of the crisis committee using a large amounts of fuel, of diesel, for the tractors, for the bulldozers and everything else to dig up the mass graves. And today, this is how Trnopolje looks like. So the image in the beginning, where you have the man behind the wire. Today, there's a memorial to Serb soldiers in front of the school, and there's no memorial whatsoever to the victims of Trnopolje. In Karaterm, which is another camp, there's a memorial within the parking lot of the factory. So the tendency is for it to be invisible, basically. And one of my favorite sentences when I was researching this was by Radoslav Brjanin, who was basically the political mastermind of the camp system in Prijedor and in Banja Luka. He wasn't a perpetrator himself, but he was the political elite of the Bosnian Serb government there. When one of the journalists asked him in 1982, how will you explain this to the world? He said, Hitler, Stalin, and Churchill had working camps, so why can't we? We are in war after all. And whenever I finish this presentation on Bosnia, I always like to put up a picture of the Uyghur victims right now in China, because this is something which currently isn't either politically correct or not much talked about, but it's something which is definitely maybe 100 times worse than what happened in Bosnia. But it's something which we definitely need to talk about and need to keep it there alive in the discussions. And with that, I hope I finished.
You managed to finish in time. Thank you very much, Hikmet, for your presentation. Now I would like to ask Vlado again for his beautiful intermezzo moment.
In the summer of 2011, a young Syrian man we will call Akram was enjoying his summer break. He was in his last year of university, dressed well, had a girlfriend, was into rock music and basketball, and spoke fluent English. In any other country, he could have had a fairly normal, almost boring bourgeois life, graduate from university, get married, buy an apartment, have children, go on occasional holidays to Lebanon and Turkey, and live happily ever after. But on one fateful day, which he remembers like nothing else, Akram was arrested on the streets of Damascus, shoved into a car, blindfolded and beaten all the way to the compound. Before he realized what was happening, he found himself in a torture dungeon, hanging from the ceiling by his wrists. As a computer geek who had never been even spanked by his parents or been in the fist fight, Akram was known as a gentle boy who was homely, by a tutti. The only reason he had been arrested was because he had liked a social media post criticizing the Assad regime. The power cable swooshed through the air, thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of sweat, and landed on his skin like a hornet bite. It took his breath away, at first shocked him into an involuntary bestial scream, followed by the excruciating pain a second later. "You want freedom, right?" yelled the torturer sardonically as he whipped him again, using his full force. "Here's your freedom." Blood flowed down Akram's tender back and legs and dripped on the dirty cement floor. He remained at the Air Force Intelligence Branch at Meze Military Airport for 3 months, a stay which changed his life forever.
Thank you. Now I would like to ask you for your part of presentation.
Thank you very much, Alma, and thank you all for coming here this afternoon, this evening, to talk about a particularly difficult and stressful topic. I just want to just one little maybe disclaimer, piece of information that might be interesting, and that says something about how I perceived Hikmet's book, and we'll talk about comparisons a bit later. I think we are roughly the same age. We both have a child that's about 2 years old, and since I had my son, I basically in the 2 years I have to confess I haven't read much. But there's one book that I read cover to cover, and that's Hikmet's book. And once I finished it, that's when I sent that message to Alma. So I can really recommend all of you to read this really difficult, but I think particularly relevant book. And I'm sure in the discussion we'll get into kind of comparative elements that are, I think, very instructive in general. Our book, because of course for Syrian Gulag, my co-author Jaber Beker, who himself is a survivor and a researcher of the Syrian prison system, the story of the book is that we met in 2017. Jaber was doing a reading of his other book, which was on one of the prisons in Damascus, close to Damascus, it was a hospital prison. And I asked him, why is there no overview book of the Syrian prison system or the Syrian prison regime? Because it was then 2017, so already, millions of Syrians had fled into Lebanon, Turkey, Jordan, and also into Europe. And almost involuntarily, I was meeting people who had been in prison, even when I didn't want to. Let's say Syrians would start talking about prison experiences themselves. So I started, at some point, it dawned on me that apparently this is a country in which people are imprisoned and tortured at a particularly frightful level. So I thought I need to do something with that. And right around that time, I met with Jaber, and we decided together to write that book and to fill that gap in the literature and the knowledge. So such a book didn't really exist in Arabic. Also, there were some memoirs, some particularly good memoirs as well, such as a book by Mustafa Khalifa called The Shell, which is a really difficult book to read. And there are a few other kind of forum contributions or self-published, serialized, for example, Lebanese newspapers here and there. But not that much. There was no overview. We didn't know, for example, much about it. And if there was one silver lining of the Syrian crisis, is that millions of Syrians were out of the country, and they felt relatively safe to talk about their experiences. And so we decided to focus on this, and then we realized, as you do research, you start understanding the topic through the research. So beforehand, we had no clue about how this whole system looked. We knew it was particularly relevant. The Assad regime is a particularly authoritarian, violent regime that's been in power since 1970, when Hafez Assad staged a coup d'etat, and then in 2000 when he handed over the reins to his not-so-bright son, Bashar al-Assad, who was in power since the year 2000. And we came in the book to the conclusion, and that's also the table of contents, that the Syrian Gulag is a four-dimensional system of imprisonment, detention, and torture. And those four dimensions are the civil prisons, they are in random order, the intelligence branches, the military prisons, which can be called camps, I'll get to that in a minute, and the secret prisons. And these four dimensions, they coexist. They sometimes gear into each other, sometimes they work together, and sometimes they compete. But together, this is a kind of ecosystem that has been in place since the 1970s, continued into the 2000s, and since 2011, the system has been working at maximum operation capability, to the extent that at some point it was even overworked. And in a nutshell, that's one element, the four-dimensional. The second element is the title, so Syrian Gulag. We have permission to use the term from Gulag experts, just to point that out, because we spoke to a number of people who were experts on the Soviet Gulag who said, we explained them how this system was set up, how it functioned legally, sociologically, and what impact it had on Syrian society. And they said, well, basically, on the scale of Syria, of the Syrian Arab Republic, there are very interesting similarities there. And this is an important thing I think we should also talk about. The disproportionate impact beyond the directly imprisoned people that has a widespread effect on the society. And the third conclusion maybe in the book is that the way that these four dimensions gear into each other is that the intelligence branches, those are the intelligence agencies, I'll get to that in a minute, these are the questions we ask in the book. So how does the regime build its power through the system? How do the perpetrators function? And this is very important because the perpetrators were relatively faceless and unknown. And then finally, how did it affect Syrian society? Here are some drawings of survivors who drew up the ways that they were tortured in prison. Of course, there are no images of that per se. Unlike, for example, maybe in Bosnia, there are images and photos here and there, what Hikmet showed. For Syria, we don't have that because it's fundamentally prohibited to take photos inside the prison, even by the perpetrators. Even if some of them break that rule every once in a while, there's no mass leakage with one exception. Now, the Assad regime is a heavily armed system. And I just saw that my PowerPoint actually has Hikmet's background, which is nice. That's a really good kind of, I like that. That's actually better than my background. The Assad regime is an armed to the teeth, deeply authoritarian, highly violent system and regime that has four apparati of violence: the army and the police, which is, let's say, fairly normal in terms of monopoly of violence of a state. Second, the intelligence agencies, in Arabic known as mukhabarat. There are 4 intelligence agencies, which has now been reduced to 3. Third, there are the special forces, so the kind of shock troops, elite shock troops that go around the country and crash and burn, slash, destroy, repress. Highly mobile, armed to the teeth, elite Praetorian Guards. Those are the 4th Armored Brigade, the Republican Guard, and the Special Forces. And then the regime also set up these paramilitaries, which meant that they armed civilians to repress the uprising. And all 4 of these, so the 4 dimensions that I mentioned, they will actually overlap with these 4. To start with the mukhabarat. So the mukhabarat is the generic word in Arabic in the entire Arab region, actually, for intelligence agencies. And unlike intelligence agencies in a number of other countries, they don't just gather intelligence. They have the right to arrest, they have license to kill. They're virtually, and also literally in some cases, above the law. They compete against each other, as they often do, and they have an incredible power and control over that society. In the Syrian Gulag, the mukhabarat functions as a vacuum cleaner in society. They have their eyes and ears on a wide network of Syrians, and they extract people from that, putting them in their prison, processing them in the torture systems. And from then on, you can either go to a civil prison, and then sometimes you're released, or you end up in one of the camps. So you have the large prison camps of for example, of the special forces, or the 3 major ones historically, which was Mezze in Damascus, Palmyra in the desert, and then Saydnaya, which is still functional. So that's one way that it works. So the vacuum cleaner takes out people from them, processes them, hands them over either to the camps where you languish or die, or sometimes through a civil prison you reintegrate into society to the extent that you can. And then the secret prisons, those are very often by paramilitaries and paramilitary groups. These were men, of course, invariably men who were empowered by the regime or allowed by the regime in very similar ways, actually, to what happened in Bosnia. These books are very parallel, but also the other book on paramilitarism that I wrote arose from discussions actually with Vladimir about 10 years ago, or less 12 years ago, and a long time ago, about why it was that both Milosevic and Assad, despite having a relatively strong army and special forces at their disposal, they still set up or condoned paramilitary groups to emerge. In Syria, these paramilitary groups too, they have set up their own prisons. They are often secret. It can be a room as large as this. It can be, for example, a basement in a private house. It can be a room, for example, in an apartment somewhere. It can be a farm somewhere in the countryside. We don't have the full picture of those secret prisons. There are people working on them, but of course the problem is they are secret. So how do you know that So there's a catch-22 problem there. But those Syrians, for example, who have survived secret prisons, in which there's arbitrary violence and there are no kind of prison regimes either, they have argued that actually conditions in those prisons, in terms of torture, random execution, summary violence, is significantly worse than even in the worst of the mukhabarat prisons. And that says a lot. Now, this system is best exemplified actually with personal stories. So in the book, we have interviews with about 150 eyewitnesses, most of which survivors, some of which also multiple survivors. And this is where I just want to leave you with the story of one Syrian man that we interviewed, who had this story occurred to him. A young man is arrested in 2011 for posting on Facebook against the regime. Plainclothes mukhabarat officers show up on his doorstep at midnight. Come with us to the branch, just for a quick coffee. 5 minutes. He suffers 3 months of torture. Hanging from the ceiling, he's whipped until he soils himself. He develops scurvy and a hernia in his spinal disc. After release, he goes back home and can't sleep at night anymore. A few months later, someone knocks on his door again. 2 grim men. Come with us to the branch. But sir, you already arrested me. I just came out of prison. Not yet by us. That was political security. We are the Air Force intelligence. And again, he goes through several months of detention and torture. And this actually encapsulates, in a nutshell, the system of imprisonment, detention, and torture in Syria, which, of course, is still ongoing. Thank you.
Thank you. I need that one. So have a glass of water. Never judge a book by its cover. But when we look at those two covers, we cannot ignore likeness, right? So I was talking to Vladimir, and we were wondering who copied who, because, it's not only the chair, it's in the enclosed room, the wards, like inside, system, prisons or concentration camp. I'm going to ask you first, Ur.
Well, one would say great minds think alike. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. But the cover of this, so the picture, the painting, sorry, I stumbled upon this when I was visiting a friend. This was in the United States. Was a Syrian actor, and his partner is a painter. And they had this painting frontally, like pontifically, in their living room. So, and the painting, just to show you how large it is, do you see one of these panels here, for example, on the wall? It's about that large. And as soon as I saw it, and I was working with Jaber already on the book, I immediately thought this should be the cover of the book. Because the title of the painting is The Interrogation, which in Arabic she's taken it from probably her own experiences in prison. So I asked her whether I could take a high-resolution picture of it and use it, and of course use the credits, and she was okay with that. So that was in 2009, but of course I didn't know. Today is the first time I meet Hikmet, and we never communicated about this. So it's a simultaneous invention thing, I think.
Yeah. Thank you. I think I recognize the chair on your cover. Can you say something about that?
So I have a friend from Poland who's called Pavel, and he walks around Bosnia, or the former Yugoslavia, and takes photographs of buildings which were used as detention facilities and camps. And I used to give him micro-locations of where to visit what. And when he sent me some of these photographs of Omarska, I found this photograph, and this chair looked very, very old. And I sent it to a few of my friends. And they said, yeah, it looks very familiar. And I asked him, where did you take this photo in? And he said, in the White House, Biela Kuća, which was the torture chamber inside Omarska. And some of the people say that it's probably there since 1992, because not many people enter it, or it was never renovated, maybe a few years back only. But this photograph was taken sometime in 2010, 2011, from Omarska, from the White House inside Omarska. So this is probably one of the chairs where most of the victims last sat while they were being interrogated. And I also didn't know. We just realized this morning or yesterday that we have the same book cover. So.
Thank you. And I think nowadays you can see this chair in the museum in Sarajevo of the crime against humanity, right? And as a matter of fact, the prisoners themselves or survivors of the camps, they have to manage to get it there because it disappears once from this White House, and they took action to put it into the museum. Thank you. So, and then I will switch to you, Ur. Before I came here, I asked my social network, do you have some questions for those two guys? And if you have them, please share them with me. And I did get a few, and one of them was, but why is this interesting for us? Meaning us as Dutch. And this is the question that I often get, almost 30 years, every time when I bring up Srebrenica. Why is this interesting for us? Why is this relevant for us? Why should we care about this? What do we gain as Dutch society to care about this story? Question for you.
Yeah, I mean, beside the obvious relevance of the fact that the Dutch and Bosnia, there's a long history there, I think, comparatively speaking, I mean, if there's a genocide on one side of the world, and or the Civil War and there are massacres, or there's somebody's tortured on one side of the world and then survives and migrates to a different society. That trauma now is part of that new society, right? Because people acquire citizenship, people have children, those children, they are in society, the person gets a job or makes friends circles, etc. So the trauma becomes it's like an oil stain. It starts affecting other people as well. And I think that with immigration societies, and I mean, last statistics are at least a quarter of the Netherlands people, like say, with migrant background, which is a number that's going to increase only. So speaking for example, Syrians or Iraqis, since the 1990s and 2000s, I mean, so many people have come in who have so many experiences of violence that you can't just say, oh, that was a long time ago, that was far away. We're not going to. That doesn't concern us here. That doesn't make any sense. The question should be, I think, well, how does it concern us, and how should a society like that react to it? And the most obvious ways are, of course, in terms of healthcare, right? So, I mean, I once went to, for example, to the trauma center, the ARC trauma center in Diemen, and then in a waiting room, you hear all these languages. You hear Arabic, and you hear Kurdish, and you hear Farsi, and you hear Pashto, and you hear BCS. So that's one element of it. So there's a pressure, of course, on the mental health care system and healthcare system, but also for the simple fact that violence is a global phenomenon. It doesn't concern one place at all anymore. It concerns others as well. So neighbors, kids, they start asking, for example, the kids, why do they behave in a certain way? Or there are examples of kind of educational policies, right? So for that reason, I think that, and that doesn't count only for the Netherlands. That's also the case in France or Germany or Canada or you name it. But some societies are better at integrating those collective experiences into the national identity of that society, and others, they do less so. And I think I'm someone who believes in the first strategy. I think we should integrate these experiences into the collective self-image also of the receiving society. But that's still a long way to go.
Thank you for your answer. Hikmet, you start your book with a study of the term concentration camps and description of concentration camps through history. Some critics have indicated that you cannot compare, for example, concentration camps in Bosnia to Holocaust. Why is it important for us to understand how the concept of concentration camps changed through history?
Well, I mean, the term camp, just like genocide, is a term which people use a lot all over the place and so on. When the camps opened up in 1982, when they were publicly visible, there was a title on the Daily Mirror in Great Britain saying, "This is the echo of the Holocaust." And this was, of course, a tabloid. It wanted to have this catchy title. And basically, I think it was very interesting for people to see that there was a camp, there was a barbed wire in Europe half a century after Never Again, half a century after the Holocaust. And at that time, the Bosnian government also made these connotations to the Holocaust and so on in order to get attention, which was, I mean, sometimes perfectly understandable. But later on, when more and more information got out, when more and more survivor testimonies, and when we got to know better the whole entire thing, that's when we realized that, that's what I show in my book, that the Bosnian Serb camp system belongs to the family tree, to the same family tree of all camp systems in the world throughout history. So from the Cuba crisis to the Boer Wars to the Chinese camp system today, but they're all different. So each camp system is similar, but it's different. Like in the case of Bosnia, unlike Syria, the camps were makeshift. They were improvisations. They take a school, use it as a camp for 3 months, clean up the blood, and bring kids back into school again in that same school year. Whereas in Syria, you have the same military prison for the last maybe 30, 40 years. And that's the same thing with the gulags, with everything else. So to understand when we talk about camps or genocide or whatever else, it's always important to understand that using a term such as genocide or such as camp doesn't necessarily change the brutality of it. So if there were 10 people kept in a basement, all tortured, doesn't make it less worse than if it was a barbed-wired huge structure containing 70,000 people. The idea behind the containment of people in such a small area and the way how they were treated was what was important. So that's why I wanted to show this, and that's why I got some critics from Bosnian scholars, because I say that it's not comparable to the Holocaust. It's not the same as the Holocaust. In some cases, it was the way the perpetrators were different, like in the Holocaust, than the Holocaust. The perpetrators in the Bosnian case knew the victims. Teachers killed their students, students killed their teachers, neighbors killed neighbors. This wasn't very much the case in some other areas, except for maybe Rwanda or Sierra Leone or wherever else. But there are many similarities. There are many differences, and we don't have to compare it to each other in order for it to make it more brutal or more horrific than it really is.
Thank you. And you actually also compare it to Gulag, just like we heard. Last week I was reading your book as preparation for this, and one of my friends saw it on the table, and he said, like, Syrian Gulag. If I see the word Gulag, I'm thinking immediately of Soviet Union. So do you experience this being confusing for people? But you still choose to introduce this term and to compare it to Gulag.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think every study. I mean, our book is on Syria. Hikmet's book is on Bosnia, but inadvertently, every case study also is implicitly comparative. There's always in the back of your mind. There's always you think, well, if I use the term camp, for example, how do these four experiences, for example, how do they compare with other experiences? Or in our case, for example, the intelligence agencies, prisons, how does it compare with globally or even regionally, for example? So the Gulag thing is that, I mean, I was lucky enough, so at NIOT we have two experts on the Soviet Gulag. And so, of course, when it comes to like imprisonment, detention, forced labor, torture, for example, I was privileged to ask these colleagues, do you want to take a look at these experiences in Syria? And they did. And they said there was a lot of similarities there for a number of reasons. Mainly, the main argument, I think, for using the term Gulag, rather than a populist way. So if you go, for example, in the bookshops, there are books like Britain's Gulag, or American Gulag. So yeah, America has a lot of prisons, millions of people are in prison there. So somebody wants to sell books and use the term American Gulag, and that can be really legitimate as well. Or Britain's Gulag is about the decolonization war in Kenya. But we didn't want to use it in a sensitizing way. We actually want to look at how this is similar and the disproportionate impact that the prison system makes on the society. That's absolutely key here. So, because in a number of neighboring societies, so let's say in the north you have Turkey, or in the south you have Jordan, or in the west you have Lebanon, the prison regimes there, they operate very differently than in Syria. Because in Turkey, for example, also for political reasons, this has changed a bit. But let's say in the last 50 years, we compare the last half century, there are people who go to prison, they come out, and then, of course, the immediate impact, for example, on the family or the environment or on the society in Syria is many factors higher than in a number of these comparative, like neighboring societies. How? Because we suspect that the Assad regime tortures and releases people, so they go out and tell the rest of society how awful it is and that you should never cross the line of criticizing the regime. Mm-hmm. So not only the person who has to deal with the physical trauma of his body and his mind is affected by it, but also all of his family members are affected by it. Also, the person, for example, who owns a business wants to give him a job. He can't give him a job anymore because he was a former prisoner. Mm-hmm. He was a zek, as they say in the Soviet Union. So the stigma that the person has, can't get a passport, can't work for any government agency anymore. His friends ignore him in the streets, totally isolated. poverty for the rest of his life. And of course, the rest of society that's gossiping about this. Do you know that guy? Have you seen what happened to him? So the impact on all those people who are not in prison, they're also impacted by this prison regime in an incredibly also transgenerational way. So we also interviewed people, for children of former survivors, former detainees, survivors, and their lives are absolutely marked fundamentally by their parents or one of their parents' imprisonment experiences.
So, thank you very much. This was actually one of my questions about the collective trauma. Both of you did write about it. And it's also actually about the very reason of existence of those camps. For some, in Bosnian case, it was about displacing and extermination of a group of ethnic group, while for the others it was more about oppressing people who disagree with the regime. So those people, they don't have to do anything, no crime at all. They could end up in concentration camp or in prison and being beaten, tortured, and even killed. You cannot go to legal system because this is also in the hands of the regime. And Hikmet, you argue that those camps and the brutalities are brought about to create this collective trauma, so that even survivors would never think of returning even to their homes, even if they survive. And in your case, I understood it was more like secondary concern, but yet both of you try to explain how this existence of those camps really affect people and the communities. So we just heard actually how it affects Syrian communities, but maybe you could say something in Bosnian case.
Well, I mean, when we talk about this theory, which I call collective trauma, the reason why I coined it, use this term, was because whenever we talk about war crimes, atrocities, genocide, whatever, we always look at numbers. How many people died? So, in the case of Prijedor, you say 3,500 people, 4,000 people were killed out of a population of 100,000, and then somebody somewhere makes a statistics and says, it wasn't that bad. Only a small number of people were killed and so on. But the thing which I wanted to show in the book was that even those who survived are the living dead, basically. Their lives are entirely destroyed, and they're still living. So their lives actually were destroyed in 1992. They continued living in St. Louis, in Trondheim, in Norway, in Amsterdam, wherever, in Australia. They started new lives, and the experience they had in the camps was so brutal that they don't even tell their kids what happened. So when I talked to some of these people, they would open up more to me than they would to their kids. Because some of the things which happen inside the camp is something which Edward Weinsman calls shame camps. These were camps where they wanted to make people ashamed of what they survived, what they saw, and so on. And the amount of things which was done, especially to the men.
Yeah, maybe you can share one example with us how they use it to traumatize the whole community. So
the passage which Vladimir read earlier was something which I always use as an example. So the school Hasan Velatovac in Visegrad, out of the number of people who were incarcerated there, around maybe 12 people were killed in total. But that severed head of Ibro Šebanović thrown across the room where 500 people were there, and these were women, children, and elderly, is something which everybody remembers. Because you have a room which is maybe 2-3 times the size of this one. You have 500 people cramped, sitting down next to each other. Everybody's hiding behind everybody else. And then this, head flying across. This ceremonial executions which you have. Public ceremonial executions inflict collectively a trauma on the people who were incarcerated there. And I have several friends who were at that time kids in that camp, who were there, whose parents didn't allow them to watch all of these. But they hear the noises, they remember the smell, everything else. And even though a small number of people were killed inside of Visegrad, 1,660, the pain which was inflicted on that community was so much that the community has been entirely destroyed. That's one segment of my book, where I show that population-wise, all of these 4 towns, which I use as case studies, demographically were wiped out in 1995. So the Bosnian Serb perpetrators, if they wanted to kill each and every prisoner, they could have done so. But by inflicting this kind of trauma, you made them never return back, never want to return back.
Yeah. There is another concept in your book about local characters of the camps, that you pay a lot attention to micro and meso levels when it comes to decision-making and power dynamics in those camps. You argue that while the manner of committing those crimes was consistent, the way that they were carried out and the intensity of it was different from place to place. Can you please explain that to us?
So usually when we talk about genocide, we always think that there's some higher power which gives the instructions to the local guys to commit the crimes. In the case of Bosnia, the local municipal government was the one executing the plan, the criminal plan, and it depended on many different aspects to what extent and intensity this plan was executed. So it depended on the personality of the president of the crisis committee, the president of the chief of police, the historical background, what happened in that area in World War II. For example, in Prijedor, there was a large context in the sense of World War II. So some of the crimes which were committed there was seen as some sort of revenge for the World War II genocide against Serbs in Jasenovac, whereas this wasn't the case in Bijeljina or in Visegrad. So the local dynamics there affected a lot, and these local crisis staff. So these were people who, for example, knew these are small communities, small towns. People knew each other, and I think this makes the crime even worse. That's where the trauma is worse, because if you see your high school teacher, for example, the president of the crisis committee, the chief of police in Visegrad, and my dad is from Visegrad. He was my dad's Serbo-Croatian teacher in high school. So he became the chief of police in 1982, and he basically singled out his former students who needed to be executed. So if you trust your, high school teacher as your, idol or whatever, your school president or whatever, and then he tomorrow is the person who decides who lives and who doesn't, you won't have any will to go back to this town anymore. And so it was his decision personally who was to survive, who wasn't. And this local dynamics is something which was left to the local authorities to execute themselves. So they had the right to do that. They had the autonomy to do this. And that's why the crimes which were committed, you can't ever say, we were just following orders, because you weren't following orders. You had the autonomy to deal with. The idea was kick them out as much as possible, and you had the autonomy to decide to what extent you wanted to inflict pain on the local population. So that's the local dynamics, and that's something which makes it even much more complex when we talk about this term reconciliation or peace or whatever else, or coming to terms with the past, because it's different from area to area. It's different from town to town, basically.
So do you recognize some of those structures that Hikmet just talked about from the local character of the...
I think so. To some extent, Syria is more centralized. So the intelligence prisons, for example, they roughly have the same... let's say torture methods, let's say in the north, or they have in the south, or in the east and the west of the country. It might differ per branch, like per agency. So the military intelligence might be, for example, more into torture, electricity, for example, but the Air Force intelligence more with just kind of blunt instruments and beatings. But you do get that with the secret prisons, of course. So you do get there there is indeed that autonomy, right? So you have complete freedom to do with these detainees what you want. And then, so why is it that then some people have, for example, a certain level of violence and others a much higher level of violence? And there we're really getting into the agency and almost the creativity, actually, of the perpetrators, which is also very much, indeed, it's a personality thing as well. So there's some, for example, perpetrators who are like particularly sectarian, so racist, let's say, in the Syrian context, where they single out people for a particular infliction of pain. Or for example, there's an example of a torturer, for example, who used to be a professional boxer. So he used his victims basically as a punching bag, to use that example. So you get a little bit of that. So there's a particular norm of violence. This is what you have to do with these people. And then some people are above the norm of violence, and very few are under the norm of violence.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but this is going to be my last one, and then I'm going to ask you if you have any questions. My next question is about a very difficult topic we rather don't talk about. I saw those beautiful illustrations in your book. I don't know if I can call them beautiful, but they are very much impactful. And there was one illustration in particular that caught my attention. And Hikmet, you also used some pictures of the buildings that served as camps. And I add a picture of the camp from Bosnia next to the illustration of a Syrian victim. Two different countries in different times, different place, and those people have experienced the same torture. How does it work? Oh.
Naar rechts. Ja, nog een.
Nog een keer?
No?
Okay. We don't see.
Oh, here.
Yeah.
What do we see here? I'm going to ask you, Ur.
Yeah, so the drawing on the left is an example of a torture method where cigarettes are extinguished on the body of the victim.
And why did I put, you think, the picture of Visegrad nearby?
Yeah, because the Vilna Vlas hotel was the rape camp where women and girls were raped inside the building. So.
And this was often the mark of the perpetrators, like marking
the victims.
The victims that they would rape. I find it very important to mention this subject because it's a subject that we don't like to talk about, but it's happening in all of those concentration camps. And I think we should do more research and write and make documentaries and films and so on about this subject too. So thank you. I think it's time for you guys. If you have any question, please just raise your hand and I will come. Just one?
Oh, there's so many.
And please say your name, if you want, and ask the question.
Okay, thank you. My name is Paul Aerts. I'm working on the Middle East at the University of Amsterdam. I have a question on comparisons. We have heard a lot of cases being compared. Would you consider the Gaza Strip as a concentration camp? This term has been used by Baruch Kimmerling, which is a well-known Israeli sociologist, as you may know. And it's being repeated constantly by Norman Finkelstein, for which he is heavily criticized, because it's much overblown, as people say. Do you think it's a proper term to use in the case of Gaza?
I can say, to start off, during the siege of Srebrenica, for example, there was a title inside Srebrenica saying, Srebrenica, the biggest open-air concentration camp in the world. I see that more as a message, just like in the case of Gaza. I wouldn't say that it constitutes a camp itself. It's more as a besieged area which has a lot of similarities two camps in the sense of not able to, permission to go out, go in, get food and stuff like that. But it doesn't, in my opinion, doesn't constitute the camps which I wrote about.
I think, yeah, that's a very good question, and it's very legitimate to ask that question. I think, in my perspective, so with the size of the camp, where does the camp end, and where does the siege begin? Let's say, right? So I've also looked at sieges in Syria, and there were a number, of course, or Aleppo, recent Aleppo, Homs, of course, and eastern Damascus. And the eastern Ghouta is very interesting. This is the area kind of just east of the capital of Damascus. These are the suburbs, or the banlieues, or the slums, as you wish. And both in size and in population, they roughly had the same as Gaza, roughly 2 million people, roughly the same type. And also the type of confinement and keeping the level of life subsistence artificially low, right? So if there was no siege, then people could get baby formula, they could study, they could move, they could travel, so they could eat, etc., 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 or they could get they could get insulin, things like that. So then the question is really, how do these sieges compare, and where does the concentration camp end? Indeed, so the Srebrenica or Sarajevo siege, and where does the camp begin?
So thank you. Do we have another question? I will come to you later, okay? I'm going to start somewhere here. Yeah? I'm going to...
Oh, sure. Thank you very much. My name is Olga Zavileva. I work at Utrecht on the Russian prison system. So predictably, my question will be about the Gulag. I was very interested in how you apply and how you decided to apply the term Gulag to this case, obviously. And coming from kind of definitions of the Gulag in relation to the Russian prison system or the Soviet prison system, which is all very hotly contested, one of the ways that this disproportionate impact on society has been measured is actually through the way that the Gulag has impacted populations beyond populations that we normally imprison. So in Western liberal democracies, we normally imprison poor people, marginalized classes. But once you get to an authoritarian regime, like the Soviet Union, you start imprisoning educated middle classes. And that's kind of the spillover of the prison system into the rest of society. So I was wondering how far this class dimension constitutes part of your definition of the spillover of prison.
And the question is for Ur. Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Olga. Great question. I think so. Jaber, he once said because his education was cut short because he was arrested. He was in university, then they arrested him, and that was basically the end of his educational career. He still has difficulties picking it up now after about 15 years. And then he often says, I graduated from the University of Sednaya. Sednaya is the prison where he was at for 2 years. And by that he means that he actually learned more in that prison because of the intelligentsia that was all stuck there, which were from either kind of center, let's say center conservative, let's say, Islamic thought, or center-left socialist communists. Those were the largest populations for a long time in Syrian prison. And he said that he learned so much from them, much more than he would learn actually at a Syrian university, which only churns out, Ba'athist, nonsense. And so, for example, he learned English there in prison, despite not speaking a word of English when he went in. So that class element is definitely one of it, the disproportionate impact. And then one more thing that we shouldn't forget, which is the Soviet Union had for a long time an alliance with the Assad regime, already from the 70s onward, and now Syria has it with the Russian Federation. There is at some point also transfer of knowledge from the intelligence agents, from the KGB, to the Syrian Mukhabarat. Now, I know, for example, Afghanistan, okay, that was a communist intervention. So the largest prison in Afghanistan, Pulit-Sharqi, in Kabul, it stands as the symbol of imprisonment. There's a vast camp, actually, in this country for decades, an incredible symbol of terror and torture, is a Soviet blueprint. And the question to which extent these Syrian camps are Soviet-influenced, so there's transfer of Gulag knowledge from the Soviet Union to Syria, remains to be seen. But of course, that's a difficult topic to research because we have no access to Russian materials and also not to Syrian materials.
Thank you. I saw a hand here, right?
Thank you. Hello, thank you for your presentations. I'm looking forward to read the books. I specifically want to thank Hikmet for his wonderful work, very meaningful, important work. My family, close family, was in camps across Bosnia, specifically north. Some survived, some didn't. One remark first, and then I have a question. A remark, perhaps, I find it that you speak a little bit too lightly when you say people were dead inside after, because in my own experience, they weren't. They were very resilient and they wanted to live. Obviously, it made a huge impact on their life. So a lot had heart attacks immediately after or died young. So there are not many survivors. And we talked about transgenerational transmission that also impacted the whole family. Those who are still alive are terribly disappointed with scholarship, academia, scholars of war who are silent for half a year now since the assault on Gaza has started, because much of what you show we see on a daily basis on our screens. So just before coming here, I watched what's going on specifically with the exhumation of bodies and torture that happened in the hospital. Latest assault, 200, 300 bodies, I don't know anymore. And it's all out there, right? And I looked you up, I couldn't find anything in that direction from you. So I wonder, how do you guys as academics see your agency responsibility role right now, like half a year after we are watching this?
Thank you. Who wants to go first?
Well, I can go first. Yeah, I mean, maybe I was too light today in the presentation, but in the book I'm a bit, maybe I'll act stronger when I talk about collective trauma and everything else. When I say the living dead, I'm talking about the people who today, after 10, 20, 30 years, wouldn't like to remember the different roads which led to their villages, different people they used to hang out in schools and so on, because of the disappointment which they had from their former neighbors. But also the people who don't want to come to terms that their former neighbors turned out to be perpetrators. So there's a double disappointment there. When it comes to Gaza and everything else, the reason why I wasn't vocal is because why does my opinion matter, firstly? I'm not an expert on the region. I don't know the language, and I do not dare to talk about an area where I don't know the language, just like I wasn't vocal about anything else. I'm a scholar on Bosnia, and I've spent my last 20 years or less dealing with this topic. And we know each other from a conference in Sarajevo, if you remember, where I also did a talk about memorialization. So there are plenty of people who know English and who can deal with Palestine, but the number of people who speak English and deal with Bosnia, if I may dare to say, who live in Bosnia, in Sarajevo, is narrowed down to 2 or 3 people. One of them is me. So I can't spread out to that extent to deal with other people or victim groups worldwide. I must be honest in that sense.
Thank you. Ur, because you have been vocal about this, right?
Yeah, I mean, I do speak Arabic, which I learned specifically to be able to understand Syrians and to speak with or interview with them, which is an investment, takes a long time, but then you have something. So inadvertently also we're involved in this. Is the same region, of course, is an adjacent. These societies, Syria and Palestine, are deeply entwined. They have historic ties there. And so, I mean, yes, I'm vocal to the extent that, yeah, I mean, if I think that I can make a contribution that actually is useful, then I'll make that contribution, but not for the sake of making a contribution. So there was a forum, a special forum in the Journal of Genocide Research on Gaza, which is ongoing. I think almost all of the pieces are published now. So if you scroll there and you find the piece "Mass Violence in Palestine," I wrote a piece there that you can find. I think maybe 2 more things. One is, you know, what I found, because you mentioned it, every new episode of genocide I see often triggers survivor communities. Right? So when the Russian Air Force started bombing Ukraine, I know, for example, Syrians who, they went through a very difficult period and then they picked themselves up by 2020, 21, 22. And when the Ukraine war happened, they had a relapse mentally. Because the sight of these destroyed buildings and the children running away from the bombing of the same Air Force, and often the same pilots, actually, who served in Syria and then served in Ukraine, re-triggered these people, and then actually they started speaking out about, we told you guys about Putin. So I think that's an important thing. So you also get a sense of solidarity, actually, between surviving communities, and that's heartening, I think.
Thank you. Other questions? I'm going to hold the mic.
That's good. Hi, I'm Sara Jafic. I'm the granddaughter of the man who's found in Tomasca, who was murdered in Karaterm, and uncles from Manjača, Omarska, from that region. How do you see the youth, that this collective trauma impacts the youth living in Bosnia? Are they segregated from other ethnicities, or do you see some collective possession?
And the question is for Hikmet. Thank you.
So I think collective trauma affects not only the youth who live in Bosnia, but also the youth who live in Amsterdam or wherever else. I think it's something which is deeply rooted in the oral history of families. For example, as I said earlier, my family is from Visegrad, and up to 1992, every member of my family knew about 1943. There wasn't a single book you could read about it, but everybody knew what the Chetniks did in 1943. So the oral history and that trauma, which is transmitted through oral history inside families, for every New Year's, for every Bayram, for everything else, you always talk about the camps, you always talk about the barbed wire, you always talk about the food portions in the camps and so on. And this is the way how you talk and how this trauma is transmitted, and that's, I think, something which affects all of us. I mean, and which will continue to affect us in the future until until we transform the trauma into an educational tool in order to learn from it. So I've met many kids who just like I mean, I have a friend in Austria who only learned afterwards that his father had a war experience, after coming to Srebrenica once and then learning about it, not because his family never told him. So one way or the other, this youth some way learn about what happened in the past. So it still affects, and it will affect us for a long time.
Thank you, Hikmet, also for mentioning that this is not only about kids or youth in Bosnia, but also in diaspora, including you. Thank you. I think you had a question, Lucy. I'm going to hold the mic.
Thank you. I have a very brief question. It may not be something that either of you have looked at too much, but to a certain extent, the violence is kind of extra legal, right? It's above the law, but at the same time, in both Bosnia and in Syria, it's enabled by judicial systems and also political systems. And I was wondering if you had looked at, or if you heard from survivors about how, police investigations or legal kind of terminology is used to kind of enable this kind of violence.
And the question is for?
So it wouldn't be the case. I mean, maybe this would be more in the case of Syria than in Bosnia, because the most of the arrests which happened in Bosnia during 1992 weren't part of any formal investigation. So there's no paper trail to that extent, or maybe there was, but we don't have access to it. So that's one thing. The other thing is that formerly the police officers, and especially in my book I write about the reserve policemen, who were the ones who took part in the crimes. The only evidence I found to this extent, which was available to me, was different certificates or permissions to go through town for different people, which is handed out by the police station, confiscation of personal weapons, hunting rifles and so on. The role of the municipality for me is much more interesting, because the municipality was the one which allowed you to leave your hometown if you handed over or sold your personal belongings and house to the municipality. So you give me over your house to the municipality, then you can get a free pass to Zagreb or to Karlovac, and in return this house will be given over to depending if it's a good apartment or if it's a village, it will be given to a high bureaucrat from the Serb Democratic Party or to a Serb refugee from somewhere else. So I think the municipalities here, the non-perpetrators who didn't commit any crime, who did all the paperwork for the expulsion, is something which I looked into much more further, but which isn't part too much of the book per se, because it didn't have a lot to do with the camps. But the police were quite careful in not allowing a paper trail to be left behind.
Yeah, the type of documents like perpetrator documentation is extremely important in studying like any genocide, and unfortunately, we don't have that luxury for Syria. There's one organization that has collected perpetrator documentation, Mukhabarat archives in those regions where Assad lost territory. And they're not making it public, so we don't have that. But what is interesting in terms of the legal element of it is that despite all this torture, Syria is a signatory of the Convention Against Torture. And as such, it's being sued by this state and Canada with the ICJ, right? These are proceedings ongoing. And what we do know from a few of those documents that organization that collects those perpetrator files, is that nowhere in any of the Assad regime documents does it say that you should torture people. Mm-hmm. Not a single one. There's no order to go and torture these people. So if at some point, let's say tomorrow the regime falls, and we get our hands on all of the documentation, then you won't be able to prove that actually there was an order for torture. Mm-hmm. So then why does it happen then? Well, I think this has to do with the informal, not informal, but unformal professional cultures that have creeped into this torture, and that only you can reconstruct through eyewitness testimony.
And just to add, one thing. I think this also has to do with the Soviet Union, because this legal formalism and the newspeak, the different words, the different wording which is being used, like informal talks for torture. That's a term which was used, informativni razgovori and anything else in Bosnia, is quite similar to Syria. And the legal formalism which was used in order to justify the crimes was something which we see to some small extent also in the former Yugoslavia.
Thank you. Because of the time, I think we have time for one last very important question. And after that, we are going to have some drinks, right? And if you have questions, you can ask Hikmet, Ur, and others. So who says, I have really, really, really important question that applies to all of us? 1, 2, 3. Okay, we are going to hear the questions. Just please ask the question, and then it's up to you which one you want to answer.
My name is Dion van den Berg Pax. We work in Bosnia for 35 years and 25 plus years in Syria. My question is on responsibilities and justice. So you explained, Hikmet, there was the general instructions, but local governments in particular played a key role in how to implement, etc. So there is a system of collective responsibility in a way. If you look at the Hague Tribunal, the most important instrument to deliver justice, it doesn't accept collective responsibility. It's all about the individual responsibility. So how do we discuss the relevance of collective responsibility in a context in which the most important legal reaction, being the ICTY, is not talking about
I'm hearing PhD proposal here, right?
Perhaps for you then, Alma.
Collect them. Okay. Who else? Erna, right? And you. Okay. I will give the word to Erna first. Sorry. I'm going to hold the mic.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Well, thank you for this presentation. I have a question about. I see. Of course, a lot of similarities between it's both about the Bosnian case is about prison camps and the Syrian case is about prison camps, but they have also, I would say, a completely different essence or goal. Whereas what I've understood of when you call something a concentration camp, that it is directed on the extermination or removal of a particular group of people out of society, either kill them or transfer them to other parts, which is, of course, also closely connected to genocide and a genocidal system. But what I see here, and I don't know much about the Syrian system, but what I understand of your presentation is that this system is directed in disciplining people, the own people, in complying with the political system. So I would say there is an essential difference between these systems. And as we are in a meeting on concentration camps, I would be particularly interested to hear from Ur whether you place this system in a concentration camp-like system, or whether you would say it's more appropriate to talk about, well, as it's on the cover of your book, on Gulag, and what is the different politics of that?
Thank you. Also very complicated question. And the last one.
Hi, my name is Ognjen. I'm from Bosnia as well. I wanted to ask, I heard you say something very interesting. You mentioned genocide, and you mentioned how it is not important how many victims there were, in what ways it happened, etc. That the act of killing, torturing somebody, etc., is what is the most important. Now, that doesn't go together with the story in Bosnia, where one side is still denying genocide. The whole political system, half of Bosnia, is still denying genocide, and the other half is forcing the story of the genocide. In this case, we have a completely radical situation, especially in the past few weeks and in the past few months, especially now with the whole idea of war beginning on the 2nd of May and stuff like that in Bosnia. Just because of the resolution about the Srebrenica genocide in the UN being adopted on the 2nd of May. Now I ask you, how do you think we should approach remembrance? How do you think that we are able to encompass all three sides of remembering all three sides of victims in Bosnia, to somehow be able to appease, well, all three sides, at least in a political sense, where nobody would feel left out, and Dodik or some other radicals would not be able to say, oh, see, they're only remembering their victims, they don't care about the other side, etc. So that just goes on to the story, because Dodik is the one always saying, oh, it wasn't genocide, oh, it's a big criminal act, whatever. So, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Thank you very much. And as I am the moderator, I choose the last question, because we have today Hikmet Karcic here, and he is not that often in the Netherlands, and this is the topic that we wanted to hide out. And another two are very much important, but I think we could have some small conference on those two questions either, and to discuss it and to invite even more scholars, right? Do you agree? Yes, of course you do. So.
Look, we can answer the other questions also later on. Definitely. I mean, especially the one with collective responsibility. That's really a very huge, complicated topic. But to go on with the thing about remembrance, the situation in Bosnia currently is again, quite difficult, and like every election year, it's election year this year. But the one thing we need to know is that up to 2010. Up to 2000, between 2006, 2010, the situation in Bosnia was quite okay. I mean, people were. Dodik at the time was saying that Srebrenica is a genocide. I mean, it doesn't even matter what he thinks. I mean, just to make that clear. But Srebrenica is like the bottom line. That's the red line. We can go beneath that, honestly. I mean, we can talk about everything else, but Srebrenica is, it's a door shut. I'm not going to persuade anybody whether it's genocide or not. For me, it's a clear-cut case. Either you accept it or you're a genocide denier. That's it. Currently, we've passed that time when we were proving something which is scientifically proven through DNA analysis. I'm not going to do that anymore. So when we talk about remembrance, and that's the reason why, and again, Dodik isn't acting because of himself, but because of Belgrade or Vučić. And the whole regime, and they're using Srebrenica as a way to mobilize their masses, their local masses, for not only elections, but for many other things. And then when you have that, then you have the Bosnian politicians who are going to step up and defend the genocide or defend the Srebrenica without doing anything concrete about it. So it's all a lot of talk without anything concrete. And so I was looking at this Srebrenica resolution, which is okay. I mean, it's really very, very, very minimalistic, to be honest. It doesn't say who committed the genocide. It doesn't say, who the perpetrators were. I mean, it's a lemonade resolution. It's something very, very easy, which could pass through everything. But then you have the Serbian ambassador getting the Russian ambassador to call the Iranian ambassador, to call the Bosnian ambassador, to influence the Bosnians to pull out. Understand? So we had the Iranian ambassador the other day denying genocide on a early morning tabloid show called Informer in Belgrade, and then very quickly later on, after we reacted, he went on to say, "Oh, I didn't mean that. The translator made a mistake." Blah blah blah. So currently, the geopolitical situation in the world is as such that this is being used, unfortunately, in order to mobilize different political thought against it. So the number of countries which will be probably against the resolution in 10 days' time will be mostly African countries and some countries from the non-aligned movement, most of which are Muslim countries. So if you want to see who is going to vote against the resolution, just look at the countries which didn't vote for Kosovo. You're going to have the same countries there. And I know this because I'm taking part in the whole process for the resolution, in the lobbying of this. So the resolution is something which is very minimalistic, and in reality doesn't mean much. The resolution itself, the UN resolution in the General Assembly, the end result says that you're going to have an educational campaign within the UN, which is the same for the Holocaust and for Rwanda and everything else, but that doesn't really mean much in our everyday lives. But the Serbian regime right now, Aleksandar Vulin and Mendodik and everybody else, they're using this as a tool to say that the West is going to delete Republika Srpska, shut it down, which isn't possible at all, and that the whole entire Serbian people will get this baggage of being genocidal, which isn't the case. So now we have this side which is using it again for election purposes, and then we have the other side trying to, all political elites in Bosnia trying to push back and so on. And the people who are working on the resolution, which is 5 or 6 guys in Bosnia, we're the ones caught in the middle, basically. We don't have anything to do with each other. So that's the case right now. And remembrance, I think we just need to go back to the time when the ICTY cases were respected, when war criminals and rapists weren't met up with a music band in Visegrad and in Prijedor and in Banja Luka and in Belgrade. We just have to go back to 2006 to 2005, and we will be back on track, basically.
Thank you, and thank you. It has been a long sit, but your presence here, I think this is the biggest compliment to the authors of those 2 terrific books. If you want a copy, you can get one over there, right? And if you have any questions, please stick around and ask them. Thank you very much.